Great. Thank you all so much for being with us. James, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being our speaker today.
No problem. It's so nice to see everybody. All right, let's see here. Share screen.
And give us a little thumbs up if you can see James's screen okay. Wonderful.
All right. So this is a brand new presentation. I've not done this one before, and I've never presented via Zoom or any virtual manner before, so I appreciate everybody putting up with any hiccups I might have with this. And we'll get started here. All right. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I am James Faupel. I am the Restoration Ecology Coordinator out at the Litzsinger Road Ecology Center. And prior to working out there, I worked out at Shaw Nature Reserve as one of the horticulturists out in the wildflower garden. So I have quite a bit of experience with native plants. I've been working with native plants for about 14 years now, and really enjoy it. And a lot of times I get questions about, why are we doing this? Why are we using native plants? Why should we use native plants? And, what does success actually look like when you are using them? So what to look for in your yard. And since most of us are here in St. Louis, we are pretty much confined by the parameters of being in an urban or suburban setting. And so that has some effects on what we might actually be able to see. Now, is everybody seeing all of the faces here? Since you see my screen, are you seeing everybody else's faces as well as mine? Andrea?
I just changed, I changed it to speaker view, but I can keep it on gallery view if you want to see everyone else's faces.
When it's just still up on mine, so I wasn't sure if it was showing up for everybody else that way.
Oh, okay. Too. Okay. Yeah, okay. You'll always see it because you're the presenter.
Okay. All right. So why should we be using native plants? These are the main reasons here. Benefit to wildlife, pertaining mainly to food and shelter. And we know that populations of wildlife are declining. Research that just came out last summer was showing bird declines. About a quarter of the bird population in North America has declined since the 1970s. And these are kind of shocking declines. So we know that the native plants are playing a big part in the food web. And so trying to just keep them around is going to help wildlife in our area. And so then the natural beauty of native plants, their resiliency, and leading to less costs just by using less water and less chemicals in our yards, an educational experience for our children, and they're educational for us as well. So they're very entertaining and exciting for adults. Why is it not switching? There we go. And so one of my professors in college here in St. Louis, this was one of his sayings. He was a MDC ecologist, so he worked for the Missouri Department of Conservation, and this was one of his quotes, "They add spice to life." And I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this drawing from either school or just teaching children this, but this is the food web. And of course, they're right at the beginning on the first level, absorbing the sunlight is plants, and then just feeding the rest of the wildlife. And this has been made pretty prominent here recently by Doug Talmey's research. within the last 10 years or so. His book, Bringing Nature Home, was very popular, and the research that came out of his research lab out of the Northeast brought this information: 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars are needed to raise just a single clutch of chickadees even. And so that's a staggering amount of caterpillars needing to raise just one clutch. And that's going to take a lot of plants to feed those caterpillars. And so that's just one clutch of birds. But 96% of all of our North American land birds are eating insects and feeding insects to their young. And so that's just going to take a lot of food to be able to feed all those birds. And that's going to take a lot of native plants to feed those insects. And also coming out of the Talmy lab was a lot of information on the plants in North America and Eastern North America and what they are doing to supporting these insects. And primarily birds are going after young insects. So either caterpillars, beetle grubs, soft fly larvae, things like that, things that are soft, that don't have the exoskeleton on them yet. And they're easy to catch. They don't have defenses yet, but they can feed their young these. And mainly Lepidoptera caterpillars are what were studied by the Talmy lab. And you can see here, right at the top of the list, are the Quercus, which are oaks, and they support over 557 species of caterpillars, so Lepidoptera caterpillars. Butterflies and moths are Lepidoptera. And if you just go down that list there, you can see so many of our native plants there at the top of the lists. And going down to the very bottom of the list here, a lot of these zeros are a lot of the non-native plants that we use in our landscape. And so, whereas these plants are not necessarily performing a valuable function to wildlife, we still do use them in the landscape. And if you haven't read this book yet, this came out last year, or actually the beginning of this year, I'm sorry. Nature's Best Hope by Doug Talmy. I highly recommend this book. It's his second book following up on Bringing Nature Home. Just very good, giving some really good hope in these times of wildlife decline. And so insects are also facing pretty staggering declines. There's been a lot of research going on this in recent years, and could very well be one of the reasons why bird populations are in decline. But 90% of herbivorous insects, so insects that eat plants, are specialists. So they specialize on either a certain family of plants or a certain genus of plants, or sometimes just specifically a couple species of plants. So 90%, that's a very large amount of insects that are relying on certain plants being around for them to be able to survive. And then when it comes to bees, a lot of people are very concerned about bees. 25% of our native bees are specialists on a certain type of flower. So like this bee here is a sunflower bee. If you don't have plants in the sunflower family, you will not be able to have this bee around. So it specializes on those flowers. All right, and so when we're talking about native plants and trying to select native plants, native is a very broad term, right? So this is the state of Missouri. Usually when you hear the word native plant, you know, around here, you'll hear things like, oh, Missouri native plants, things like that. But that can be very deceiving. These are the different ecoregions of Missouri. And you can see St. Louis is a really great spot for diversity because we're in this area where a lot of ecoregions are intersecting. But you can see that some of these are pretty far away, and the different ranges in temperature and climate across the state can vary greatly. And so bringing in a plant from the southern portion of the state or from the far northwestern side of the state is not necessarily probably the best idea. That's not what I would consider a native plant to us. So I would generally say if you're going to be putting plants in your yard and want to be helping wildlife, you're going to be wanting to put plants in that were from our actual region. So the St. Louis region. Now here's an example of just this. This is a Missouri native plant. This is Yucca glauca. This is a yucca that is native to Missouri, but it is only native to a very small region. If you look at this USDA map, you might be like, oh, it's definitely here in Missouri. I can go ahead and plant it in St. Louis. That'll be fine. I'll be helping wildlife. Are you really? So here's its actual range into Missouri. You can buy this plant and put it in your yard, but will it be really helping anything? Will it be actually having those benefits to the food web? And so here it is. And this is the primary pollinator of Yucca glauca, and it is the yucca moth. And it is actually a specialist on the yucca, where its caterpillars eat the yucca. So it's actually lays its eggs inside the flowers, and the caterpillars eat the seeds. And this is from Discover Life. It's one of many entomology websites online. And the data is not completely great on collections, but if you go to many other sites too, you'll see this a lot too, where the range of this insect is almost kind of like a U shape around Missouri. And so if you planted this in your yard, would you actually be getting this moth? Probably not. The data is not really great on it. And more research is being done on these kind of subjects all the time. All right, another little bit about plant selection. So these are our native redbuds, but these are cultivars of redbuds. And there's research going on if these plants like this with different colored leaves, which are sometimes called nativars or cultivars of our natives. And this redbud is found in St. Louis, so it would be a good idea to plant redbud in our area. But will insects actually use these redbuds that have these different colored leaves? There is research going on about this, that insects will more than likely not eat the foliage of these plants as well as they would our straight species redbud. So, this is our native hydrangea. You can see the pollinators are really loving it. Just going to town, some beetles, the bumblebees. There are these big flat top open flowers, and the pollinators just go wild on them. And this is one of the cultivars of our native hydrangea. You can see this poor little bumblebee flying around trying to get inside. The bumblebees are probably one of the only ones that can actually get in here and access some of the actual true flowers. I wish the picture would still show up here. Let me play that one more time. You can see the true flowers of the hydrangea here on the interior, but they're pretty inaccessible to most pollinators. And the bumblebee is pretty strong. It can try and pry that apart, but you can see that there's not as many pollinators just visiting this plant. And to whereas that one native hydrangea I showed you earlier had pollinators just flying all over it, gathering up pollen and nectar. If I just go up and down scanning these native hydrangeas that have this cultivated big flower head here with inaccessible flowers, just because they're showy to us, it is unfortunately not accessible to these pollinators. and so not serving as much of a purpose for wildlife. And so here in this shot, you can see a leafcutter bee on our straight species native purple coneflower. And in the foreground here are some cultivars or nativars of the purple coneflower, where there's just there's no accessible flowers. So these right here are all the individual flowers that the bee is getting nectar and pollen from, and you just cannot access them here because we've cultivated it to have these showy, poofy flower heads. Very beautiful, but unfortunately not useful for this leafcutter bee. And just want to throw this out there. I am not a purist by any means. I definitely understand the need to have beautiful showy flowers in our yards. It makes us happy. There's a good balance though, right? And so to help wildlife, there's been some research here recently out of the Talamy lab that showing that the chickadees that they've been studying, so a nesting pair of chickadees needs within their foraging range at least 70% native plants to be able to have a successful fledge. So it's showing that we do need to strike a balance. And in my yard, I have probably about 75% native plant material. And you can see there I have my nice Chinese Kusa dogwood there. I have a bottlebrush buckeye over here, which is a native to North America, to eastern United States, but not to here. So it would be considered an exotic plant. And I have some hostas back here in the background. So I am not a purist in any sense, but I just definitely want to try and show everybody that you can strike a nice balance. And if you're familiar with the Lurie Garden in Chicago, it's a very famous native plant garden. But I've talked to the director there, they have about 70% native plant material. Now they have some very showy spring bulb shows and some summer bulb shows that come out here. You can see some of these non-native onions blooming here in this shot. And they are striking a very good balance there. They have a lot of wildlife coming in. And actually, if you counted all their cultivars that they have of natives, their nativars, they would actually have more than 70% of their native plant material. And let me just go back to that real quick. As you can see too, here at the Lurie Garden, they're able to attract wildlife just right in the heart of Chicago with all these just skyscrapers in the background. It makes for some great shots. And so this is one of our native bumblebees here in St. Louis. And it's a pretty picky bumblebee, this one. This is the black and gold bumblebee. And, show me in the comments if you are surprised or curious about this, but, where would you expect this bumblebee to be at? Where would this photo was taken? Because it is a very picky bumblebee about its habitat and what kind of flowers it likes to visit. But this is where it was, right in the middle of downtown St. Louis, in the city garden. So right here, it's pretty spectacular that a bumblebee like that could be surviving in this kind of setting. And so I'm going to kind of focus the rest of the talk, about St. Louis and what you might find here, kind of within like the 270 corridor, because the 270 corridor acts as a bit of a buffer, a filter for a lot of wildlife. There's going to be a lot of things that you can find on the western or northern side of 270 that you might not be able to find on the interior.
James, before you get into that, we have our first question from the audience. What kind of flowers does the black and gold bumblebee prefer?
So the black and gold bumblebee, I have only ever seen on native flowers. So some of the flowers I've seen it on are some of our baptisias, so some of the false indigos, and the blue stars, Ooh, now I'm trying to think back to last year. They visit a lot of the plants out at Litzsinger. But again, out at Litzsinger, it's primarily native plant material, except for invasive plants on site. But so it's pretty picky about what its needs are. So you probably won't see it in your yard if you don't have any native plant material. And I'm actually going to get into our bumblebees a little bit later in the presentation, kind of about their wants and needs. So this is the satellite image of that same shot here. You can see 270 wrapping around St. Louis. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here so you can kind of see this urban gradient. So where that bee was found was right in this area here, just very dense urban environment where you really wouldn't think something like that would be found. But we put the plants there and it was able to find it. But that is thankful because of the access to that area. So surrounding areas that already contained that bee were near that area. So there was enough distance between the two for them to be able to reach that area. And so the northern area of St. Louis here, you can see the lots are a little bit bigger and you can see more green than the main corridor of St. Louis City. And then getting into South City, a lot more packed in tight areas. And here you can see Tower Grove and the Botanical Garden and Forest Park are these big green splotches, little great oases for wildlife. And then you can see just as we go out farther out west, just how much more green happens because the lot sizes are just getting bigger. And so that's not necessarily meaning that the habitat is any better, just because you're seeing the green from here. A lot of that could be invasive plant material, which in a lot of cases it is. But you can tell that there's going to be more chances for areas to connect for wildlife to be able to move. It gets to be pretty hard for a lot of wildlife to move in between these areas. So if you live in this area, in the South City area or South County, these areas here, these are just going to be a lot harder for you to get certain types of wildlife into your yard. So you have to take that into consideration and don't be like hard on yourself if you've done a lot of work putting in native plants and you don't get certain types of wildlife. So what can you get when you have this type of environment, right? If this is your yard, you're probably not going to get a lot, right? There's not a lot that can survive in this habitat, this man-made habitat. The things you might see are very generalist types of wildlife, such as like a robin, because it can go in there and find worms. It can survive off of hunting for those. You might find some rabbits, some deer coming up and eating what little shrubs that may be up here. You may, so the robins will be happy to come visit you. They're pretty much everywhere in St. Louis. They are not picky. They're very generalist and survivors in that sense. If you add one little water feature that's fishless, you'll probably get American toads. They are throughout the St. Louis area. But you probably won't get a lot of other amphibians in certain areas. It's really hard for amphibians to move in those dense, compacted urban areas to move between lots. If you put out a bird feeder, you may be able to get other birds that might not otherwise get in that big open landscape with not much around to eat. So you'll probably be able to get a lot of other songbirds, but that'll only be temporary, right? They won't be able to survive and raise their young in your yard because they can't feed their young seeds like that. And so I'm not saying go the exact total opposite either. This might get you in trouble even. You might get some looks from your neighbors or calls from your neighbors even. And there's not saying this isn't beautiful, but it's also not helping the movement of trying to get native plants into people's yards either. Um, this is hard for a lot of people to take in. Well, some of us might very well enjoy this, but we're trying to reach out to people and communicate and educate, and this can be hard to just show somebody and have them accept it right off the bat. Now, this is a pretty traditional landscape in some of our suburban areas of St. Louis, but there's no reason, pretty much everything I see here is not native, but there's no reason why you couldn't have this exact landscape and have it be native plants. I know of everything in this shot I could replace with a native plant other than having something that's evergreen for you, but I could have this exact same look and have it be native and then serving wildlife. And same goes for some of these small city lots, right? All this could be native plant material. And then it would be serving some function for wildlife. You're not gonna be able to have a big diverse amount of plant material in such a small landscape. So you might not be able to get a diverse amount of wildlife, but still every little bit helps. All right, and when I'm usually talking to people about wildlife, uh, the ways that they've gotten into gardening or gotten into native plants are typically one of three reasons. And that's either they wanted to help birds, and so they started researching on how to help birds, or they had a really big interest in butterflies, or they had a big interest in bees. So bees, butterflies, and birds. Those are the three Bs that I like to talk to people about, because it seems to interest, one of those three will usually interest at least someone. And so we've talked a little bit about birds already. Going into butterflies, what would attract butterflies? So obviously, we had mentioned the birds are coming in for the caterpillars, right? So we need these plants to be the host plants for these butterflies and moths. And one that people are very familiar with is the monarch butterfly. And to attract it into your yard, you would need to have plants all season long. So you would need it as soon as the monarch migrates up from the south. You would need plant material for them, such as this blue star right here, this threadleaf blue star. And this is one of the earliest plants I have ever seen monarchs in our area nectar on. It's a very early spring flower, and you can see it right there, nectaring on it. And if you are attracting them into your yard this early in the season, they will stick around and mate. And if you have their host plant, they will be able to stick around and lay eggs and reproduce in your yard. And their host plant is the milkweed, and well, the whole genus of milkweeds. And so if you have milkweeds in your yard, you will be able to have them reproducing. You can see there the egg in the first instar. And then as the caterpillars grow, they will start eating larger portions of the plant. They will, once they've gotten large and plump, they will leave and form their chrysalis. And then they will hatch out and start that cycle all over again. But once they've hatched out, you again need plant material for them to nectar on. So you will need plant material from early spring into summer, such as these coneflowers, and into the fall for their migration back, such as these asters and sunflowers and goldenrods in the background. And there's many other specialists. Specialist Lepidoptera, as I told you earlier, 90% of herbivorous insects are specialists. Here is another specialist caterpillar. This is the spicebush swallowtail, and this is its caterpillar here on spicebush. The other plant that it will be on is sassafras in our region. And that is what the butterfly looks like when it is an adult. And so if you want these insects in our area, you will need the plant material for them to be able to survive. All right. And then let's go into bees. And I'm going to talk, I'll probably pretty much focus the rest of this presentation on bees because bees are the primary pollinators for most plants. 85% of all plants need animal pollination, and bees are probably the best pollinators of all because they are actually going out seeking pollen and nectar from plants, and so collecting that pollen and taking it from plant to plant and then taking it back to their young for their young to eat. And so if you go into landscaping your yard or any kind of landscape with the mindset of landscaping it for bees, you will just be able to make that landscape for many other types of wildlife, accidentally, if you will. So if you're just going out doing plantings just for bees, you will inadvertently make great habitat for many other types of wildlife. And so that's why I'm going to focus the rest of this on bees. And we'll see here. And so this here, this picture is of the European honeybee. And this is on our non-native white clover that you will commonly see in everybody's yard. And the European honeybee is not native to here. It is native to Europe and Asia. And it is quite often the focus of conservation efforts of bees. Unfortunately, like I said, it's not native, but it is something that we rely heavily upon. So much of our agriculture is non-native plant material. So we do need these non-native bees to pollinate that. But I would highly recommend, if you're wanting to know if you're being successful in your yard in supporting wildlife, is really learning to identify a lot of the insects and birds and other visitors to your yard. And so the European honeybee is not a sign of success in your yard. It is pretty common in St. Louis. It will pretty much be in everybody's yard. It will visit non-native plant material and native plant material. And it's a very good a very good generalist. So it has no trouble going to many different species, especially species that they weren't used to. So since it does visit our native plants, it does compete with our native bees for resources. So there are some negative side effects there. And it also does help pollinate a lot of our invasive species. And so it does have that negative side effect as well. But, but again, we do need this bee for pollinating our agricultural crops. Now, again, I would really highly suggest learning to identify bees. These are two more non-native bees. So this would, again, not be signs of success in your yard. This is a non-native plant and being pollinated by the European woolcarder bee and a Chinese leafcutter bee. And, pardon me. So if you had this plant in your yard and you saw that you had lots of different pollinators coming to it, you might think that you're being successful in what you're doing. But again, I highly recommend getting to learn these non-native bees just so you really know if you're actually helping.
James, do you have a like go-to resource for BID for
Ooh.
like for novice folks?
Let me two books here. I'm right here at my office desk. This is a really good book by Heather Home. Is that in frame good?
Well, hold it up a little higher. Yes, there we go. Can everyone see that?
This is a really good book.
Okay.
And then this one by Joe Wilson.
Okay.
These are both really good. But also, I would highly suggest if you're going to be trying to track a lot of the insects and pollinators, birds in your yard, using some of the apps that are available nowadays. iNaturalist is a really great one. If you get some really good pictures, so let me go back here. If you can get up close to some of these bees like this and snap a couple good shots, trying to get things of like their head and their back and their abdomen, clear, like even this one is a bit blurry, but it is good enough to be able to identify this bee because you can see the markings on its abdomen. And so if you would enter this in iNaturalist, the computer program would probably help you identify that right off the bat. But if it didn't, there's a lot of specialists online there that'll take a look at your photo. And if it's good enough, they will help you identify it. And you can even set up a project in your yard to be able to just track all the flora and fauna in your yard, which would be really neat for yourself and also help scientists around the world. Excuse me. Because on iNaturalist, there is a lot of, it's all open source data, so anybody can have access to that data. So keep that in mind as well, that if you're doing this in your yard, that people can see what is planted in your yard and the insects that are there. But no, it's going to a good cause and helping a lot of researchers out. All right. And so when it comes to bees in Missouri, there are 450 plus species. And here in St. Louis, we have a staggering 200 plus in the city. That is spectacular. There's been research recently out of the St. Louis University Bee Lab by Gerardo Camillo about in recent years, them studying different plots across the St. Louis urban gradient. And so their surveys were mainly within this region, and they noticed that the northern area here, that you can actually see that it is a little bit more open lots in this region, and bigger lots, a little bit more green to it, even from this view. That was where the most diversity was, and so as you went south, the diversity dropped off. And so in this area of the city is where there was less diversity of bees, which is pretty interesting. But you can probably imagine why. A lot of the yards in this area were probably being kept a little bit more tidy, probably more herbicides being used, maybe less plants in the yard. Insecticides might have been getting used, whereas some of the vacant lots in different areas up in here that have been let go, or just any kind of fields, like Calvary Cemeteries up in the north area. We have Forest Park. So there's a lot of great habitat within this area. And so it doesn't surprise me that that's the case, really. But what is interesting is when you can actually go into the heart of the city itself and still find a lot of these pollinators, because they can fly, so they can make that trip. Whereas if you had a big native planting in the middle of the city, you're probably not going to get a lot of reptiles and amphibians, and maybe some types of mammals coming into that area, but you'll be able to get things that can fly into that area. All right, and so talking about bees, as we were saying too, bees are just this great way of seeing diversity, happening. If you're just focusing on that, and our bumblebees, which we have 7 species in the St. Louis area, well, 6 now. We had 7. They show a pretty good rule of measurement of the quality of the habitat. It's quite interesting, really. The common eastern bumblebee, the first one we'll cover here, shown here with its single golden stripe on its abdomen. It is a pretty generalist bumblebee. It will visit many native plants. I've seen it on so many. I've lost track of all the different species, but I've seen it also visiting so many non-native plants. So if you have any kind of plant material in your yard and you see a bumblebee, you're going to have this bumblebee. It is pretty common throughout St. Louis. I have And anywhere I see flowering plants, it's usually around, whether they be native or non-native. Now, just as a little step up from that, the brown-belted bumblebee uh, visits quite a few native plants, but I've seen it visit some non-native material. So it's more than likely, if you have non-native plants blooming in your yard, you may have this show up. If you have just a few native plants, even, I bet you anything that you have the brown belted as well as the common coming into your yard. All right, now this one is probably where we're just kind of slightly stepping up the measurement, right? So this one is the two-spotted bumblebee. It's pretty common in St. Louis, but it's really only going to be common if you have native plants around. I have seen it only visit one or two non-native plants, and I was actually quite surprised when that happened because my just history of seeing this bee has just mainly been on native plants. And so if you have a native planting in your yard, let's say you're even like in the South City area where it's a little bit harder to, expect the connectivity to be very great for wildlife, you would probably more than likely see this bumblebee show up in your yard if you have a good assortment of native plants. So know that that is a good sign of success, having the two-spotted show up. Now these next two are a little bit pickier. So this is the black and gold bumblebee and the American bumblebee. They look very similar. They have very similar abdomen here and thorax. So on the abdomen here, it has just two yellow bands on the black and gold bumblebee, which can be hard to see sometimes. But the American bumblebee will have an additional yellow stripe right here, as you can see. But unless you're getting lots of pictures close up, it can be hard to see that sometimes. So these two can be really hard to separate, and the fact that they're both about the same size and that they're both pretty picky. I have only seen these in higher quality native plant habitats. So if it's actually like a conservation area, somewhere where there's a prairie restorations happened, a large native plant planting, that's when you're going to see these bees typically. Now, that's not to say it's not going to happen, that they wouldn't show up in other areas, because I have seen it happen. It's just the most frequent occurrence of these two are going to be in a little bit higher quality habitat, or a bigger habitat, I should say. So where there's a more diverse amount of plant material, native plant material. But like I was telling you earlier, this is the one that I saw in the city garden. So that was really cool to see. But it's been seen nearby in higher quality habitats, so it's easy for it to have made the trip to the city garden. Now, this is number 6. This one you're not very likely to see, but if you see this in your yard, that's going to be a good sign of success of your native planting. This is the Southern Plains bumblebee. It is threatened in the United States. It's only been found in a couple areas of St. Louis, and most of those areas were high quality prairies. A few of them reconstructions, and one of them is a remnant. So if you do see this in your yard, know that all the native plant work that you've done is paying off. That you're very much helping out. And this is number 7. So like I said, we used to have 7 bumblebees here. This is the rusty patch bumblebee. It is no longer in St. Louis. This bee was only ever found in St. Louis, recorded at the Litzsinger Road Ecology Center. And this, you can see here, was recorded back in 1998. And so it is now extirpated from this area. So it's not extinct. It's extinct locally, but it is still alive in the United States, up in the Great Lakes region. So we still have the bee around, but this is the one that you might have heard in the news in the past year or two about being the first bee listed on the endangered species list. It's not the first bee to be in trouble. There is a bumblebee that went extinct out west. I'm blanking on the name of it. But so, it's just that this bee was the very first listed on the list. So there's lots of other pollinators in decline, but bumblebees tend to get a lot of attention because they're pretty big and cute looking. Now, when it comes to St. Louis, though, we have this pretty neat kind of measuring stick when it comes to these bumblebees, which is really interesting. It's pretty neat to have. And so for your yard, Ed Spivak, the pollinator specialist at the St. Louis Zoo, I was at a presentation of his a couple years back, and he had suggested to the audience that, from his experience with bees, that if you have a small yard and you're trying to get as much, diversity as possible, but at a minimum, is to have something that's blooming basically at all times. And he suggested at least 3 species for each season. Now, when it comes to plants, you probably already know that the flowers don't last an entire season. Most of our flowers are lasting these kind of more shorter periods, not what our human seasons are. So plants that are blooming in early spring, late spring, early summer, late summer, and early fall. So these are just some of my suggestions that I put together that I know are really good pollinator plants and can help out bees specifically, but are going to then also be very useful for butterflies and then therefore birds as well. But so we have bluebells, spring beauty, Jacob's ladder, and geranium are all really great early spring woodland perennials. And then I also threw in here some of these really important woody plants that are just big workhorses of spring trees. So redbuds, serviceberries, plums, and prairie willow. Willows in general, really, but prairie willow is a more manageable one for the home landscape. But all 4 of those are just fantastic pollinator plants. And, these are just some of the ones that I feel are the kind of shining stars of some of our natives. So if something's not on the list, that doesn't mean it's not a good plant. These are just some of my suggestions if you're just trying to get in that bare minimum, especially in a small space, in a city space. And just a quick look at serviceberry itself here. I'm a big fan of it. It is one of the earliest flowers I've ever seen bumblebees on. The earliest I've actually ever seen were on our golden currant, one of our native shrubs. And I saw the common eastern bumblebee and brown belted bumblebee on that this year, very first plant I saw them on. And then immediately following, they were on the serviceberry and redbud. But serviceberry I highlighted, and it's got this number 124 after it. If you go back to that Doug Talmy list earlier on, and how many Lepidoptera species some of these woody plants support, this is a good winner here, going for our straight species serviceberry. So that's Amelanchier arborea, and 124 species of Lepidoptera are supported by this plant in Eastern North America. And it's not just a great pollinator plant, it then becomes a great plant for yourself if you can beat the birds to it, because it has fantastic berries. But it just supports a ton of different species of bees. And this is a little mining bee here. And to know that it's a mining bee, I'm not sure the species on it. This is a Andrena. So the genus is Andrena, and it's a type of mining bee. It has these little stripes of hairs right alongside its eyes there, and that is a good giveaway that it is an Andrena. And like I said, of course, many of these spring flowering trees and shrubs will put on berry shows later in the year that birds are going to devour up. And this here is a Cornus florida, our flowering dogwood. And if you have the ability to, I suggest you plant in mass. It's going to be a bigger attractor to wildlife, especially to bees, in your yard. So this may be a bit much for your yard. This is a very big planting, but it is a showstopper. But this is what a bee is going to look for. If you have just 1 or 2 purple coneflowers in your yard, it's going to be hard for a bee to make the decision to exert the energy to come to your yard if there's other food sources around. Now, if this was next door to you and you had just 2 purple coneflowers, you're probably not going to see the bees coming to your yard. But if your 2 purple coneflowers are the only coneflowers for miles, you're more than likely probably going to see some action happening in your yard. So take that into consideration. If you have a small piece of property and you're going to go with native plants, try and go with a smaller a smaller diversity of plant material and plant more of those, so you're more likely to have insects and other animals come to your yard for that specific plant.
James, real quick question. Yep. What conditions are best for purple coneflowers?
That's a good one.
How much sun and spacing? And
so it's kind of picky about its soil conditions. It does like pretty nice soil conditions, but it is typically a savanna plant, or kind of like an edge of prairie plant, to where there's going to be some shade and some sun. So it does not like being out in full sun, like you would see in this picture. This is at a botanical garden where they were probably watering the heck out of these. There's probably a lot more maintenance going on this than meets the eye. But so typically it likes that kind of dappled shade kind of situation, to where it is still getting plenty of sun. If you put it in too much shade, it's probably not going to bloom well for you. And another thing too, pretty much in our urban and suburban habitats, we're going to deal with rabbits and deer, right? Rabbits love purple coneflower. So if you only plant 1 or 2 purple coneflower, they're probably going to get eaten by rabbits, not going to lie. If you plant a planting like this, you'll never see what the rabbit ate, right? But so plant enough knowing that these things are going to be eaten by wildlife. That's the whole purpose of this, right? You're supporting the food web. So don't get upset when things get eaten by the little rabbits. Just plant enough for everybody. But yeah, it is kind of a picky plant. I've seen a lot of people put it out in full sun and then it gets scorched, and they weren't taking good care of it, or they were planting it in clay soil, and that's not compact clay soil, and that's not what it wants. In maintenance, so native plants were really misleadingly sold as no maintenance for the longest time. There's plenty of maintenance in all forms of landscaping. Don't think that planting native plants is going to get you out of more work. Working at Litzsinger and at Shaw Nature Reserve, working in the gardens there, there was full-time staff working there taking care of these gardens. So there's plenty of maintenance behind these plants to keep them at a high quality appearance. Now, that's not to say if you have something like set up in the backyard, and you're trying to let it go wild, have at it, but if you're trying to keep up the appearance of these plants and trying to keep that status quo in your neighborhood, you're probably going to be wanting to watch the maintenance a little bit. And watering might be something that you need to do, especially during the summer drought periods. All right, and some other maintenance tips just in general for helping out wildlife. Letting your lawn go a little bit. You don't need to have the perfect lawn using chemicals and everything. That's not going to be helping out bees. What's best for bees is actually letting a lot of the native plants grow. If you can get spring beauties in your yard, that is a fantastic pollinator plant. Leaving the common violets, leaving dandelions, even though they're not as used as frequently by pollinators, they can sometimes be the layover plant, as it will. So if you had Virginia bluebells blooming and then the geraniums were going to be blooming next, but there was a gap in between the blooms, the pollinators are going to need something. And a lot of native bees actually do visit dandelions. I've been watching them quite closely this year, and been seeing quite a few when I didn't see other plants blooming. Now, when a lot of other plants were blooming, I saw hardly anything on the dandelions other than European honeybees. And so leaving that lawn go, not running over it constantly with a lawnmower, gives chances for things to nest in it. This is one of the little andrinas we were talking about earlier. And it will nest right there, right amongst all the spring beauties, so it can go out and pollinate. This is another type of andrina. And the spring beauties, there we go. Look at that little should say little lady with her pollen pants there on. And then the andrina going and collecting on a dandelion. And so other types of things to leave for wildlife, bare open patches. So bare patches in the lawn or bare patches in your garden where you're not mulching. So that last one we were just talking about was a mining bee. This is a cellophane bee, and it needs these big disturbed patches of soil. This was actually at a construction site. And unfortunately, they came back and shortly after I took these pictures, they came back and raked the soil flat and threw down straw and grass seed and everything and covered up all these nests. I don't know if the nests were, completely, if the females were completely finished laying all their eggs down there or not. But very unfortunate to see. But it was a very cool find at first to come across. And then leaving some areas where it's leaves and debris, and leaving holes in the ground where rodents and snakes might have made holes, because right here you can see that my cursor is going around is a queen bumblebee coming out of this hole. So they actually put their nests down in the ground where other animals have already created a hole for them to use and have left. So they are going to want cover, they're going to want leaves covering up holes, things like that. So a little bit of messy gardening in some areas is going to help out a lot of our bees. And by doing this kind of method, leaving leaves, leaving standing brush and things like that are going to get you other types of wildlife as well, not just the bees. You're going to get caterpillars being able to overwinter, lightning bugs. So in my neighborhood, I have moved into my house 15 years ago and started using native plants almost immediately in the yard and building up the habitat. After 8 years, I finally got fireflies in my yard. I am the only yard in my entire subdivision that has fireflies in it, and I'm pretty happy about that. So that's one measurement of success that I would say. So it took them a while to find it, but an adult at some point in time, or multiple adults at some point in time, finally found this little space in suburbia and were able to lay their eggs.
James, another quick question.
Yep.
What flowering plants do you suggest we have in hanging baskets to attract native bees?
I would say a really good one. I'm going to take back what I was just thinking. Let me think on that.
Good question, Lynn.
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of like the planters and stuff we did out at Shaw Nature Reserve, a lot of the native containers I've had experience with were out at Shaw Nature Reserve, and none of them were hanging baskets, but some of them were like elevated planters. And one of the ones that we like to use for draping over the edge was rose verbena. Now, I've not myself been able to like really survey rose verbena and see what pollinates it, but it has a very similar flower to phlox, and phlox isn't pollinated much by bees. It would take a very long-tongued bee like some of our bumblebees to do so. So it's got a very tubular flower but it's quite possible our bumblebees pollinated. I'm not positive though, but what does pollinate it is like our clearwing moths and other moths and butterflies. So still a great plant, but it is a great one for hanging baskets and a very showy one. It's one of our few native plants that has a very long bloom period. And here we see some maintenance happening in the garden. So some cleanup happening of small stems of plants that are going to be, just kind of small debris, not very sturdy stems, but cutting back of some of the sturdier stems to a certain distance, not cutting them back all the way to the ground, because a lot of these sturdier stems that can hang on for the rest of the year and have a pithy stem are great nesting habitat for a lot of our little carpenter bees. So they need this kind of stem material. And again, you create one type of habitat, right? And it's going to create a whole lot of habitat for other things. So it's not just bees that are going to be using this, but other insects are going to do this as well. Little types of flies and wasps and other insects. Pardon me. And then, of course, like I was saying earlier, young insects in their larval stage are the perfect food for birds. Let's see if this plays. You can see this little chickadee tearing apart the stem, working away, trying to get at those bee larvae or other insect larvae inside there. And I've seen many types of birds actually do this, this method of tearing into these stems. So yes, we do want the bees to reproduce, but we do realize that, like, all these caterpillars that we're bringing in, we do want the butterflies, but we also want the birds, right? We want the entire food web in our yards. Leaving logs, down logs, something you might not want to do in your front yard, but in your backyard, it's a great thing to do. So many different types of insects are going to come into this and start breaking down these trees. So much life is going to devour this tree, and then that's again going to feed the rest of the food web, right? So there's types of carpenter bees that will nest into soft old wood. So you'd want logs of different ages. You can see here, there's actually moss growing in the hole of this carpenter bee's hole. And then you're going to have other things, like beetles and their grubs are going to be eating this wood. And the wood itself is going to be a big platform for things to interact on. Again, depending on the type of connectivity you have to different types of wildlife corridors, would probably determine if you're actually going to get different types of reptiles and amphibians. But some of the things that you could get if you have that connectivity are some of the fence lizards and the skinks, the five-lined skinks and the broad-headed skinks. And there's a few more things here. So we have snags. Leaving snags up is going to create all different types of habitat, but thinking about for bees specifically, different types of carpenter bees are going to use this, and different types of leafcutter bees. So this is a leafcutter bee here, trying to find a home. And it stinks that we have to put out bluebird houses all over the place and put up bee homes and things like this, right? But if we left snags and down logs, these were their natural homes before humans intervened in the landscape on such large scales. And the things that would have created a big enough hole for a bluebird to be able to nest in a tree would have been things like a woodpecker. So leaving that type of material for these birds. And then who doesn't like their mosquitoes getting eaten? If that's the case, then you're going to want bats around, and bat populations are in heavy decline, and bats need snags and certain types of habitat. This is a eastern red bat, and it usually nests like in tree material, so leaves, big leaves. This is on a cut plant. I've seen them sleeping overnight under a pawpaw leaf. So they're just hanging out in plant material. but there's many other species of bats that will be living in snags and things like that. So we need to have cover for all kinds of things, but doing it just for bees will get you there. And then, of course, showing success in the yard is not having things like this happen, right? So having issues with your yard. So thinking about proper garden maintenance and care and design when doing your landscapes. These are local issues that have happened in our region where all the grass was removed in a front yard and nothing but a garden was put in. So people got upset about that. Somebody wasn't weeding their yard, and the native plant, they had some native plants, but a lot of weeds were let go as well, and so they weren't maintaining that, and then faced citations. And we're hearing about new weed ordinances getting put in place, whereas some areas are actually relaxing their weed ordinances for native plants. But Jefferson County actually just surprisingly passed a weed ordinance law. And then sometimes there's other issues with design and your planting. So this gentleman here in Columbia was blocking views of traffic. So people were complaining about safety issues. So taking all of those things into account is also going to be a sign of success, right? And there's nothing saying that using native plants has to be this kind of weedy look that kind of gets it a bad name quite often. This is a fantastic planting, just all these different short species on this nice slope that can tolerate drought. Looks fantastic. There in Tower Grove, beautiful native plantings right in front of lots of restaurants and being used as rain gardens. Right in front of businesses, just very nicely done and definitely helping wildlife. All those plants I'm seeing are fantastic pollinator plants. And going out to Shaw Nature Reserve, if you want to see it done in a very formal manner, some great examples of native plantings out there. And this is what we could all aspire to have. This was in the St. Louis Magazine, I believe, the 2016 Garden of the Year. It was a native garden featured on their cover. And so getting to really learn all the things that can kind of come to your yard, right? This is going to be how you can gauge the success of your planting. One of our local Wild Ones members in St. Louis, Dawn Weber, she has a 1/4-acre lot in Dogtown, and it's landscaped robustly. She has 300 species of native plants in her small little yard, and it's done very well. It's not overgrown looking or anything. She has a very nice, lovely yard. Lovely planting. I wish I could have gotten a picture of it in full bloom. But she has been, she's a big birder and she's been studying up on a lot of her insects. And she has been able to record 100 species of birds in her yard, 37 species of butterflies, and 14 species of odonata. And odonata are damselflies and dragonflies. So that's stunning success. But she's been putting in a lot of work to learn how to identify these types of wildlife. And so just kind of a little refresher, how do you know if you were successful at creating this habitat? How do you measure that? So seeing the use of these plants, seeing the nectaring happening, seeing the pollinating happening, seeing fruits being eaten, seeds being eaten, the plants themselves, probably the most importantly, being eaten. If you're seeing wildlife reproduction happening in your yard, so if you see birds nesting, if you see reptiles and amphibians reproducing in your yard, if you see predation, you're being successful. And so the diversity of species and just all of the above, if you see just a diverse amount of wildlife, you're being successful. Some of the top predators you might see in some urban areas that you might have come to your yard. And then if you see reproduction of predators and reptiles and amphibians. And of course, there right at the end, you are successful if no code enforcement employees are coming knocking on your door. All right. So if you have any questions, you can ask them here, or if you think of things later, feel free to email me at my email. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. If you wanted to follow me on there, I post a lot about native plant material on those outlets as well.